All right, wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Sam, for the introduction. We are thrilled to be here. You all look so good, friends. It's good to see you again on the screen. Thanks to all of today's speakers and panelists, Maddie for the music, and of course the audience. Thanks for sticking with us. We are gonna have a great time here. We have some introductions to do and some framing to do before we get to the questions. So let's dive in. To begin, we acknowledge that we are living, meeting, and learning as colonizers in the unceded and occupied territory of the Eastern Shoshone, Shoshone-Bannock, Northern Arapaho, Cheyenne, and many other indigenous peoples whose past, present, and future generations steward these lands. We acknowledge their deep connection to this place, established and passed on through innumerable generations, living and carrying out their hopes, their dreams, and their lives on these lands from which they were forcibly removed. We pay respects to their elders, past, present, and future. If you are one of those folks who has not heard a land acknowledgement before, that's what that is. It's simply a statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous people and their connections to this place and acknowledges our role as colonizers in that land. So my name is Greg. I'm gonna briefly introduce myself and then I'll give the panelists the opportunity to introduce themselves as well. I'm a member of the Jackson Hole Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Collective. I'm also a facilitator for our Getting Real About Whiteness series, which we will describe a little bit more later. And I'm the moderator for this session. It's my honor to do that. So I'm gonna let each panelist very briefly introduce themselves. More information can be found in your program. So if you haven't dug in there, there's a lot more detail. Let's say, Colleen, do you wanna kick us off?
Thanks, Greg. So like Greg, I am also a member of the Jackson DEI Collective. And as well, I'm a facilitator of the Getting Real About Whiteness series. Here in town, I live in Hoback and I work at City Kids Wilderness Project. I'll pass it to Dan.
I'm an old white guy, educated in the late 60s and early 70s. And I have been a business executive for 40 years. Retired now for the last 3 and living in Jackson, and participated in the Getting Real About Whiteness conversations this summer, and participated in a community foundation diversity program last winter, all of which got me, I guess, revitalized and interested in this whole area.
Thank you, Dan. Jody?
Thanks, Greg. My name is Jody Donovan. I live in Jackson. I also am on the Jackson Hole Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Collective. And I'm a facilitator of the Getting Real About Whiteness track. And I work at Teton Science Schools. I oversee operations there. Krista.
I'm Krista Valentino. I'm a Momentum alumni. I was part of the 2014 Momentum cohort, and also was part of the Getting Real About Whiteness collective group this past summer as well. I'm in the Valley about 12 years in different capacities, most of them surrounding environment, sustainability, and working across cultures, youths, and generations to really build those bridges.
Thank you, Krista, and thank you everyone for saying hello. Also, just a brief aside, thanks Dan and Krista for being willing to be a part of this panel and stepping out there as former participants from GRAW, from the Getting Real About Whiteness series, which I will often shorten as GRAW, G-R-A-W. So very briefly, we're coming to you from the Jackson Hole Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Collective, the DEI Collective. So we've been a group since 2019. We reconvened this spring and this summer with a call to action to reduce harm in our community. So one of the ways that we are doing that is through this series, GRAW, Getting Real About Our Whiteness, which centers whiteness in service of anti-racism. We'll talk more specifically about GRAW a little bit later as we progress along. And it's also important to know we do lots of other things as well. We have a website, jhdei.com, where you can see the other things that we're doing. And another thing that's relevant to this conversation is that we're soon going to be working with a consultant to help us build out a space for Black, Indigenous, people of color, or BIPOC, BIPOC, folks that supports competency and community building with a group like that. So, other things that are going on. So we have a little more framing to do. This is important before we get into the questions, because it's a critical topic, and we need to make sure that the groundwork is laid so that we have this conversation on the level that we want to be able to have it on. So I'm going to pass it to Colleen to kick us off with a little bit of framing.
Thanks, Greg, and thank you all for being here. We do want to take a minute to discuss this panel. Often when folks gather to discuss equity issues, and in particular racism, there's an instinct to turn to leaders of color, Black, Indigenous, Latino, and other people of color to come speak, teach, or share their experiences. And this makes sense, as the work towards social justice has long been led by people of color, leaders, educators, activists, and it's essential to center those experiences and that expertise and knowledge in this work. Another important understanding in social justice work is that when the same folks are repeatedly asked to represent on behalf of their identity, or as a symbol, it can lead to representation burnout and also tokenization. There are other outcomes which can be trauma or harm caused from having to share painful experiences for the learning of others, and also from having to validate their own experience to folks who don't understand it. And these aren't theoretical outcomes. They happen here in our community. So when we were asked to be involved in this summit and we sat down to plan, we got to a place where we decided to shift the topic of the panel from a broader lens of equity and inclusion to focus on whiteness in particular. And this then shifted our panel from folks of color in the collective to white folks who would be here today representing. Transparently, one of our collective goals is to shift the burden of education from folks of color in the community, and for white community members to take responsibility for working on ourselves and learning ourselves. And that's one of the key things we'll discuss today. So a key component of talking about race is actually to talk about whiteness and to understand how it functions, how it hides under the lens of normal, and the responsibility of white folks to act. In particular, in the last few weeks, I've heard this call again heightened for white folks to dialogue with each other and take responsibility for self-education and action. And so that's our intention today.
Thanks, Colleen. Well said. Now to add to the diversity of voices, we'll say, Jody, would you talk about the goal of our room today?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And thanks for that framing, Colleen. Origin stories are super important, and I appreciate being able to share that with all out there listening. Our goal today is elegant. It's simple and ambitious. It is to model a dialogue that centers race productively in our community. We hope to plant seeds for this group of community leaders to connect with, or to strengthen your already there connections with your personal power to identify and dismantle oppressive systems. In the panel, we're going to use the model that we utilize and get the work done in GRAW as we go. And as Greg mentioned, this program will center whiteness in service of anti-racism, or at least that's our hope. That's a goal of our panel and our time today. So with that, we enter this space with a rich history of harm done to Black, Indigenous, people of color when white people gather to talk about race. So we sit heavy with that knowledge and hope to provide a positive contribution to counter that. We recognize as a group of white people that we have our own limits talking about race and striving to contribute to social justice. And in that, we are inspired by and hope to amplify the extraordinary progress made by Black and brown women, and specifically trans women of color, who have continued to lead in this vital movement towards racial equity in our country and beyond. So we are very rooted in that work. To our leaders of color that are here with us today, we understand that as a group of white people talking about whiteness, we risk causing real harm through this program. We are limited in what we can interrupt or manage in real time based on our virtual format. Intentions are only one piece of the puzzle, as we know, and we welcome feedback about our impacts so that we can meaningfully address them. To those here like us who aspire to realize the fullness of our leadership, please listen with curiosity. Work hard to find yourself and the I in this conversation. Listen to inform a next step on your personal path to impact. We hope we provide a nugget. And finally, core to our work in our Getting Real About Whiteness track and in the collective in general is that the most meaningful progress occurs in the context of community. And as such, we seek to nurture critical connections through this work. And we are so pleased to have you here with us today to do just that. Greg, you want to get us going?
Yeah, let's do it. Thanks, Jody. So in your pre-program materials, you were sent a little flyer about GRAW, about getting real about our whiteness. But in case you have not dug through all of the stuff that was sent to you, there's so many great resources in there. GRAW is a peer facilitated dialogue and learning program. So we're working together, we're collaborating, we're trying to have conversation, we're adding content, readings, things to watch, et cetera, along the way. They're small group programs, so usually about 6 participants plus 2 facilitators, where we're gathering to learn, to reflect, to talk. We look through a lot of things, we read a lot of things, we talk about a lot of things. It's pretty dense. We even expanded the number of sessions for the second round of this that we're currently in now, because there's so much to talk about. And importantly, the panel and the questions are very similar to what GRAW would look like, but it's also very different because in that space, we create an environment of discretion where participants aren't speaking for an audience, they're speaking for themselves. So it's just a good thing to be aware of as we move in. So, panelists, I'm going to begin with a quote from Ijoma Oluo, who's an author, speaker, author of the book, So You Want to Talk About Race, among other things. This quote comes from one of the first articles that GRAW participants read. Find yourselves, white people. Find yourselves so that you can know what whiteness is. Find yourselves so that you can determine what you want whiteness to be. Find yourselves so that you can stop your loved ones from voting for a definition of whiteness that you no longer want to subscribe to. Find yourselves so that racism no longer surprises you. Find yourselves so that maybe I can try writing fiction for a change. Ijoma Oluo. So I'd like to hear the answer to this question from all of you, but maybe we'll start with Krista. The question is, why is it important to talk about whiteness with this group, at this summit, in this place? Why is it important?
Thanks, Greg, and thank you for asking me to be a part of this panel and sharing this journey, because it's most definitely what it is. For me, I don't know. I'm white. I've known I'm white. It's a fact. It's obvious. But I think for me, thinking about it as a part of my identity wasn't something I necessarily considered or explored, which is interesting because I would imagine that Black, Indigenous, people of color, their race is a part of them. It's their identity. And just as my whiteness should be a part of my identity, just as it is me identifying as female. And to talk about whiteness means that I'm acknowledging who I am. And I'm also understanding and acknowledging that the color of my skin also comes with privileges, also affects the way I interact with the world, the reality that I live within. And by talking about, my whiteness and all of that, it's not as though I'm trying to shed that or lessen that or any of those pieces. Rather, it's almost a reckoning, and in that acknowledgement that I see the world differently than people who have skin color differently than mine, or cultures differently than mine, or creeds differently than mine. it allows me also to form empathy and compassion for the fact that other people experience the world and have different understandings about life. And I think for me, that's the only way that I can really begin to move towards being, whether that's a true and better ally, spokesperson for it, or an actor in beginning to dismantle the systems and structures that are in place that produce those negative impacts, rather than just sitting here trying to listen from a third person's point of view.
Thanks, Krista. Yeah, I heard the words reckoning and acknowledgement in there. It's a big deal for sure. Would someone else like to reflect on the same question? Why it's important to talk about whiteness, this group, this moment, these people, this place?
Yeah, you know, I think something you said, Krista, resonated with what I was thinking about, is that for many of us as white people, we may have been unaware or uninformed about our own race. You know, what is whiteness? For many of us, it's invisible, or it has been invisible because white culture is the dominant norm in our country, and it has been for a long time. And we're immersed in whiteness in our daily lives, even if we're not recognizing that. And what we are skilled at as white people is pointing out other people's differences, and labeling folks as different. But you can only label someone as different if you're seeing yourself as normal, right? And you're seeing yourself as the norm. And our ability to do that is because white has been the norm in our country, and our dominant culture. So I think that that's kind of our first step of why I talk about whiteness, is to unpack this, to be able to see whiteness as it is in our daily lives. And, you know, that brings me to the second thing I was thinking about and why I talk about whiteness, is how does something become normal? And, you know, it either becomes normal because there's a majority of people who say it, or because someone in power has defined what normal is. And that's where I think it becomes really critical to understand what is whiteness, right? And ask this question, and understand what it is, because we often focus on it as a personal identity, and it's about us as individuals and our own identity. And what's been more radical for me to understand as a white person is that, you know, whiteness is actually a power structure in our country. And white, as we understand it today, has not always existed. But in fact, it's been constructed and it's been defined over centuries in our laws. And those laws were designed to consolidate power and wealth through the creation of political systems and economic systems that ultimately benefit white people and oppress people of color. So I think to move towards racial justice, we have to really understand the creation of whiteness. We have to understand the construction of whiteness to say, oh wait, actually this system was built on this idea. And that ultimate goal of that idea was the consolidation of power and wealth. And so I look at it in two ways. I see my personal identity, but also we have to learn to answer what is whiteness to understand its systematic impacts in our society.
Yeah, Colleen, that I actually, the way that I thought about this is sort of at the intersection of Krista, your answer, and Colleen, your thoughts on that, which is simply, you know, I'm 41 years old. I'm the chief operations officer at an organization that serves in a non-COVID year, 15,000 students from across the country, right? And I have not had any formal, thoughtful educational interactions with the caste system in our country. And these conversations are so important to me because without structured knowledge about how race works and how whiteness works and how it's functioning, it gets reduced to the least common denominator, which is the interaction, which is the thing that you say and you're like, oh, was that off? Or the thing that you hear and you're like, I think that's off. And I think about myself in the context of a leadership summit and the power that I hold. And I think about I'm at the helm of our COVID response at Teton Science Schools. And I think about the structures we've mobilized in the last 7 months that allow us to just systematically ensure health and safety and to prioritize risk and map risk and response and trade-off. And I think about if I'm in my same role and I'm thinking about a student's bad experience as a one-off, there's something wrong there. So I feel the intersection of the lived experience of both that driving it down to the personal, and then what does that mean with the power of systems that I hold and how that's expressed. So these conversations are certainly vital to what it means to me to edge into impact in my leadership role.
My biggest concern, and it's in a longer term sense, is that, and it's important for us to talk about this because in the absence of talking about this, we're headed in a direction which was going to result in civil war or the disintegration of our country as we know it. I know that sounds alarmist, but it really troubles me. And I agree with the commentary about the power structure. And there's 400 years of that being constructed. And that power structure has expanded in the last 400 years to embrace a lot of people, all white. 400 years ago, it was a very narrow sliver of white society that had that power and exercised it. And then over generations, that's expanded to include other ethnicities that are all white. And it troubles me that, we're, if you look at things like demographics in our country, we've got to embrace the fact that we're a multiracial, multicultural society. And if we don't, and how do we do that? Well, we're much better off doing that through constructive examination of our fears and misunderstandings and discussion about how to fix it than to keep our heads in the sand and try to cling to power until we end up with a real serious civil problem in our country. It's very serious.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks also to my wife who is in the background closing the windows. There's an exercise thing going on right outside our window. It's a perfect timing for it. I'm curious, hearing all of your responses there, I hear both things. I hear sort of this personal accountability, personal understanding, awareness, reckoning with oneself. And I also hear sort of this more countrywide systemic power change. I'm curious whether anyone has any thoughts about how this conversation can be rooted in Jackson. In our experience, I know not everyone watching is in Jackson, but the conversation is mostly rooted there. What do you think about that? How is this rooted and relevant in Jackson? And I'll let anyone go who feels inspired.
I mean, I think for Jackson folks, this is, it's essential work everywhere, and it's essential work here because systems of oppression are here and at work, but also the power of whiteness is very much at play here in all of the systems and structures, whether it's people moving here so they don't have to pay property tax, or it's, any number of from the policy and laws of the land that trickle down here to the individual interactions that are happening here. And I think that what is the call to action is simply that we don't have the tools. Whiteness is such that we don't have the racial stamina to even have a base level grounding to be able to access the fullness of our creativity and potential as it relates to affecting racial equity well. So I think having the base level conversation about where are you in your white racial identity and what were some challenges that were hard for you and how does white fragility show up for you in these moments, these start to give us some of that stamina and some of those frameworks to then be able to apply our smart brains to how we might best leverage our opportunities in Jackson to become more racially just. Is one way I look at it. I think that question, we need more people to have the foundation to be able to participate in the answer to that question.
Krista, as a participant, as somebody who's gone through our Getting Real About Whiteness, at least our pilot first round series of it, how does that resonate with you?
I really agree with you, Jody, in the sense that we do we are a bit of a microcosm here in this community. We do have the very big institutionalized structural societal issues that we're seeing play out around the country. And I think sometimes if we think of this as a big global or national issue, it becomes really overwhelming, but we can look at our little town of 15,000 and actually see how a lot of those things are playing out here, every single day. And I also would like to think that that gives us the opportunity to truly have more of a leading role, a hands-on role in dismantling those systems, in changing our own actions and seeing the impacts of those changes, of working with people who are open to the conversations and that you could meet face-to-face, one-on-one, and be in a small enough town that you know that you can do that civilly. And I bringing it back to this place, and what you had just said, Jody, is that we need that critical mass who are willing to have those conversations and who are willing to do that work to push us over the edge, because we're going to see that shift here if we do it. We're also going to see a lot of what Dan said, which is civil unrest, if we don't.
Thanks, Krista. Dan or Colleen, anything to add?
I think the ability to engage in some self-reflection, get people. I know for myself, I've gotten a lot of value out of my ability to do a lot of these readings that the GRAW experience exposed me to, and engage with a group in town here. We have a discussion group twice a week, and we talk about some of these issues, and it's really interesting, and it's helped me develop my a broader view and a better understanding of a lot of these issues by being able to discuss it. And it seems I'm concerned that there's somewhat of a reluctance to get involved in discussion that might in some way now be, well, we can't talk about anything political. We can't talk about anything that's disruptive. Can't talk to anything that's divisive. Yeah, I understand the how that's uncomfortable, but we've got to find the way to maintain, at the same time, in a respectful way, the ability to get into meaningful discussion about challenging issues like this. And we've got a lot of very bright people in this town, and even though we are a small town and a small community, many people in this community have a very broad network across the world. So we're quite unique in that respect, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Colleen, any last word before I ask another question? A no is also okay.
The only thing that's kind of going through my head is, Krista said there's a unique opportunity here, and I agree with that. And I think that often people talk about Jackson as a unique community, and there are a lot of there's also a lot of power and wealth in this town and in this community, and so I think these conversations are incredibly important to have here. And I also want to acknowledge that this is not, our town is not all white, and we need to make sure that we're having these conversations and that our town is inclusive for folks who are not white. And I think that's another reason that this is extremely relevant for us to talk about.
Yeah, great point. Great point. The next question, we all know, because we've all been involved in these conversations before, that talking about whiteness is sometimes really hard for a variety of reasons. And so I would like to hear from you, what what are the barriers to talking about whiteness? And I think primarily for each of you as an individual, what are your barriers? What are those real barriers that apply to you or have applied to you? Maybe likely still apply to you. And then maybe we branch it out from there. But curious, what are the barriers to talking about whiteness? And let's see, Jody, do you want to start?
Oh, Greg, I was hoping you'd pick me. Because I've been really thinking about my barriers. I mentioned one, like a barrier for me is definitely stamina to manage through racial stress. Like that's something that I work on, that like to be mindful about when my white fragility is kicking in, so that I can stay engaged and not spin out in the way that often catalyzes for me. So for me, it's definitely about just getting some, building some stamina in that space. And then I've really been thinking about two core beliefs and values that I have about being an American that are just pounded into me around, you know, a fundamental belief in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and a fundamental value on rugged individualism. And I think that it has been a slow awakening and reckoning to the real, like I've had to really look at the data about the policy of oppression, that it was never intended, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for everybody. Like never, it was never intended that way. Like everything's working the way it was designed to work. I was recently blown away by like the you know, Nazi regime coming to study us about how to achieve racial purity. Like these are things that kind of are blowing my mind still today. So that continues to need to be like exploded, that ideal that Americans are good and that we're trying for this thing. And the other piece around rugged individualism, I think has kept me from the power of connection and community, and that we just, how deeply we are really connected, and that's a powerful thing. And those things are in tension for me in how I show up in conversations about whiteness. I realize that I have perceived that white fragility piece of that feeling you get when you break from white solidarity. For me, I've conflated breaking with whiteness as breaking with community. And so I've had to have more tenacity about what are the connections that make a difference? What are the connections that are serving me and holding me to my purpose? And so that's a space I've been doing a lot of thinking. So, and those are some of the bigger ideas that I'm really in tension with, even as I've been on like another real hardcore reading kick. Every time I read something about like how where we are in this moment is actually quite intentional, I'm like, wait, no. So those are some of the sort of existential and then literal struggles that I have, that I bring to the work around talking about my own whiteness.
Thanks, Jody. Someone else?
Yeah, I would add to that, in one of the barriers I find myself having to break down is the fact that I find myself surrounding myself with people like me, and these people perpetuate the same beliefs and the same viewpoints and often look the same and act the same in all of those pieces. And so we continue these little comfort bubbles where maybe we could be a little provocative in it, but there's not much challenge within those bubbles. And so that's one barrier, is for me to actively expand that. And one way I've found to do that is being a part of groups like this, reading more, following more diverse people on social media, and trying to gather information. And so then as I do that, the second barrier comes up, which is as I hear news or conversations taking place that I don't agree with, or that I've learned something different of, knowing how to intelligently and gracefully challenge people. And sometimes actually I find that the people closest to me are the most difficult to challenge. And we talked about this thing in GRAW, which was called calling in versus calling somebody out. And my fear has stemmed from a place of that conflict of when I call somebody out, and the potential repercussions that could happen, both personally, professionally, in a community context. And so being another one of my barriers is gaining the skills and the practice in calling people into the conversation, in leading with curiosity and empathy for where they are at, and learning where they are at in their white identity understanding, and putting those all together in a way that can move me from just information gathering and understanding to actual action.
I hear your expression of the barrier as, in some ways, maybe it seems overwhelming, that all of the layers that need to come together for something to feel doable.
Yeah, it seems like every time I push through one barrier, there's the next one. I'm like, oh well, shoot, that one. Okay, now I have to deal with this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I share that barrier that Krista mentioned, of trying to figure out how to introduce a discussion about whiteness amongst a white group, and do it in a way that is likely to be accepted and lead to something productive. Keep working on that. I find that examining my own experiences and talking about those seems to be, for me, the best route, because people can either listen to that and engage, or they can walk away, and it's not anything that, and if they relate to it in some way, fine. But it's I found that works for me as a conversation starter, and it can go wherever the other party wants it to go, which could be nowhere, or they might be willing to share some of their experiences. But in addition to that, just being white is, I mean, it took me a long time to figure out that, well, of course I'm white, and it's such a fundamental element. And I remember the first, I was raised in a white community. I wasn't exposed to any people of color growing up, and so the world was somewhat monolithic to me in that respect. I remember going to Africa for the first time, and all of a sudden realizing that, my goodness, everyone here is of color, and I'm the guy that's not. That was quite a awakening for me, but it's still a challenge to accept that wow, there's a lot wrong with whiteness, and what can we do to help expose and fix it? It's a hard accepting it is, most of us, I don't, for one, necessarily enjoy the more negative elements of my life and personality, but they're there. So, examine them, see what you can do to make them better.
Interesting. Yeah. The challenge of just acknowledging what seems to be in front of you, especially when it may not
exactly
feel like it reflects well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Colleen, anything you'd like to add?
I was just going to add that, yeah, anytime you start to examine something and you realize the world is not as I thought it was, I was not taught everything, how the world is. And, when it really shakes you to, it can shake you, I think, to examine that. And so I think that's a barrier out there, is that it does involve really changing your worldview. And so that is, it challenges people's fundamental core.
Yeah, well stated. It's hard. We like to think that we're flexible, intelligent, mobile people, but maybe we're not. It's actually pretty hard to do that sometimes.
Greg, I had a thought that I think is that is relevant, because one of the things that I wanted to share as I was listening to you fine folks, I was really stoked I got to listen to the first panel of some brilliant leaders in our community talk about what it is and how to be a female leader. And so I'm bringing this up because what came up there is in some of that spaces, how do you welcome other women into spaces? How do you not look at power or representation as a single pie? How do you widen that and sort of move from a deficit mindset? And I realized that for me, I think being a queer person, a barrier has definitely been like being the queer person in the room, and then like having that be disruptive enough and not wanting to push further. So having an identity kind of push in a zone that then makes me feel like, well, I'm here, so like that's enough. I don't want to rock this boat because I'm on it. And so that's been a fun one to grow through and out of, and has been really helpful with allies in the community to sort of work through some of that. But I think it's interesting to think about how your identities that aren't race play into the way you're showing up for race, and just taking the same mindfulness to that has been helpful for me.
That's great.
I think that's interesting, what you said. In the GRAW discussions, we began looking at microaggressions, which are broad, that's a broad sector. They include race, gender, you name it. And so the examination and the identification of microaggressions for me was something I never really considered. And since I learned about them and then I started thinking and I'm trying to become aware of them, I was just stunned at how many of them I have been guilty of. And it's almost, within the walls of our home, it's almost become a bit of a game to catch each other with these microaggressions that we call each other out on sometimes because lack of awareness. So the awareness, it helps kind of tune me in a little bit and to how to be welcoming, but at the same time, not use microaggressive actions or words that might make other people uncomfortable, even though I never intended to. So my understanding of that has been really a big thing for me.
Interesting. Yes. And we have continued with that thread through through the second round of Getting Real About Whiteness. This thread of microaggression and where that goes. I think this is leading me to an interesting question here, which is that I'm putting myself in the shoes of the people who are watching, and the majority of those folks we know are going to be white. Maybe there's these white people watching who they have social capital, or maybe they don't have social capital. Maybe they have to ration their social capital to make decisions to move past challenging experiences, to challenge people or call their friends or family in. Knowing that there are all these barriers, there are these challenges at stake, and people are hearing about this. Why should individual white people invest and engage in talking about whiteness with other white people? Why should they do it? I can call on someone, or if someone feels inspired, they can.
I can start. I think there's a few reasons. I think it's essential for white people to talk with other white people for social justice work. And I think there is a strategy to it because we have a shared identity and there's solidarity there. And that can be used to open minds. And, we tend to believe what our friends believe. And so there's a grassroots element to speaking with other folks in your network about whiteness and talking with other white folks. I think certainly there is the aspect of reducing the demand on Black or Indigenous or other people of color to educate white folks and shift that burden a little from having the double burden of both racial oppression and then also having to educate other folks for your own liberation, right? And so there's a call to action there to do some of that work. And when I think about it on the next level, I think back to that quote you said in the beginning, and I think Alua said, find yourself so you can define what you want whiteness to be, to determine it. And this, this statement, this request, it really stands out to me because, as I have learned from the study of so many people, the definition of whiteness was developed over time and shaped with an agenda. And that agenda was political and economic power for certain folks. And because the definition of whiteness came out of that agenda, we really have to sit down and say, what do we want whiteness to be? Because its origin wasn't good. So now it's up to us to try to figure out this positive white identity. And I think that that's something that can come from white people talking to other white people. And I think that that's something that can happen in the space.
I appreciate you bringing that up. That's sort of individuals working together to lead towards a positive white identity. It's that's a topic we talk about in GRAW as well. Reactions, thoughts from other folks?
Yeah, Colleen, I would love to build off of that because racial equality or equality in general isn't one-dimensional. It's not a one axis. Yes, we can talk about race, but there's a lot of other inequalities that are taking place that are affected by race and that aren't, including gender equality, economic equality, equality based on your culture or your location. And all of these are all often rolled into a really multi-tiered complex system that makes up us as humans. And so when we're looking at tackling something like racial equality, we're not just talking about Black people or BIPOC people, people of color, being on the same level as white people, right? We need to think about the women, the Black women or Black women, people of color, or people of color who are women, or who are gay, lesbian, bi, queer, trans. And when we as white people are fighting for these social justices, we're rolling that all in and we're raising all of the ships. And that's going to be the foundation and the basis of how we truly create structural and systematic change in our communities, in our cultures, in the United States, and hopefully far beyond that. Because this isn't just about race, right? It would be great if it was, but it really truly isn't. This is just a one piece of it, but it's a very important piece of it.
Thank you, Krista. Interesting.
Krista, that resonates, and I think race is the key indicator of oppression in our country, and I've been really moved, continue to be moved when I, with the notion that the freedom for Black people means freedom for all, meaning that what it would take for equity, justice in that space would, by the very doing of it, elevate the ships. And that has been a keystone for me to be thinking about, as far as, because I think how do we look at the vast ways and dynamics in which oppression and identity intersect, and privilege and identity intersect, and how do we kind of go full force on something? And that's been a concept that's been really unlocking for me as I kind of dive into this work.
I think trying to speak to someone to convince them that they should support this kind of work personally or financially. I think I would try to cause them to understand the relationship of this problem and I guess what I would say the compassion. It's very tricky. It's when we have an incident like something with George Floyd, for instance, where you can personalize. I found that was a very moving situation. And then the compassion is just such an interesting feeling. Is so deep, and it compels you to want to create change. And then we see time and time again with issues where it dissipates as the group gets larger and more generic. And I think for people to try to personalize examples of where they feel they can help, and they can examine their own, their whiteness, their own views about this, and try to relate. I guess you have to eat an elephant a bite at a time, they say. But I would try to reach to people to think about compassion as they also think about their whiteness, and then how can they distill that into something they can do uh, more locally and individually, maybe. Don't let it get diluted, is what concerns me, because it seems that it's a difficult emotion to make effective when it gets larger and larger in scope of what you're trying to do with it. And the problem all emanates from, the fact that we are white and have the power, and we've got to examine it. And we know this isn't going to go well if we just ignore this.
It's great insight, Dan, as well. Thank you. This is a good transitionary period. First off, we got a Q&A question. That's awesome. If you have a question you would like us to consider, feel free to put it in Q&A. Full disclosure, there will be things that that we'd love to talk about and that may or may not be fully relevant to the direction that we go in here. So we may or may not answer all of them, but please send them our way and we would be happy to consider them. One that I would like to address is Robin asks, can you give some examples of microaggressions? And this isn't necessarily a good spot to go into all the depths of microaggressions. But there are lots of resources to go into. So first off, microaggressions, just as a definition, brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether they're intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights or insults. That's a good working definition that you can work on. I hesitate to endorse a book that I have not completely read yet, but this is an active field of both research and scholarly engagement. So the one that I'm currently reading is called Subtle Acts of Exclusion. It looks like this, by Tiffany Janna and Michael Barron. And it's just another way of talking about and thinking about microaggressions. So if you want to learn more, those are great resources to head towards. Let's see, anything, did anyone want to add anything? Was anything burning there before I ask a submitted question from our pre-summit forum? Wonderful. So we're going to try to, we've talked a lot about how this is relevant or what's important, all this background, and we're going to ask some more targeted questions now that maybe get a little more specific or potentially connect to some of the other things that have been talked about today at this summit. So here's one that I've edited a little bit for anonymity's sake. I do a great deal of anti-racist learning in my personal life and have regularly brought resources and opportunities to my board of directors, yet I don't feel like they are called to action. What advice do you have for leaders to inspire others to invest in the pertinent justice building movements? And the reason I take that question next is because I think we've talked about the imperative for individuals, for personal people to be investing and engaging with this. This is the next level. What advice do you have for leaders to inspire others to invest in these pertinent justice building movements? Does anyone feel inspired, or would you like me to call?
Well, from a practical point of view, I would say that I would examine carefully to be sure that the request to do that's in alignment with the mission of the organization and why those people are there. First, to see, is there alignment with that? And then secondly, having been on many, many boards over the years, I would recommend finding a individual or two that might be open to being educated and perhaps persuaded, because I think that within boards, the peer element between board members tends to drive this kind of change a little bit more than what most executive directors can do on their own, with all due respect to the many that we have, and I know and love many of them. But that would be my advice.
I think it's a really good question, and I think this is a space where we've been threading the needle, which is really important, about like how individual conversations about whiteness or reflection on whiteness can have systems level impact, whether that's at the system, the unit of an organization, the unit of a family, the unit of an organization, the unit of a town, county, state. So I think this question is really important, and that's where I think we get into smart systems. And there's like a lot of work to do there. In plain language, like the standards for excellence of leadership are changing, and we need to change with them. They're changing to include equity, inclusion, and edge into justice. And of course that needs to be, well, are you guys frozen?
You're good. No, you're good. We can see you, hear you.
Okay, good. I got an unstable. To everybody out there, the internet's telling me I'm unstable. Yeah, so I think I think first we need to recognize there's a standard, and then you can systematically address that, which is a little bit, I think where I've seen a struggle is with an individual who is passionate, or an individual who holds an identity that holds a marginalized identity, being called to champion or championing some of this effort. And I think that it needs to be baked into the culture of the organization, the strategic plan of the organization, and like how things are working for there to be systems change.
I'm gonna go for Kelly.
Yeah, Dan's idea of kind of like coalition building, bringing some folks together who are aligned and continuing to advocate for that. I think there's also an element of what are peer organizations doing, and there's a reality to peer pressure and seeing what's out there, and bringing that into your organization as a strategy through that lens. At the end of the day, I think getting it in writing as a priority, once you get something down as a priority, suddenly there has to be an investment of resources towards it. And so I think that's a first step for anyone who's trying to do this work at their organization, is get that group of folks together to put something down as a commitment, and then the work unfolds from there.
And I'm going to take the opportunity, since you three gave really good, tangible responses, and be a bit of a cheerleader and say that don't stop pushing. You cannot let up, and it's going to often be hard and require a lot of resilience, and you might get burnt out from it. But it's important to remember that Black people, people of color, Indigenous people have been fighting this fight since often before they were born, for generations. And as a white person hired in an organization or a business, you're already in a position of influence and privilege that those people do not have. And it's incredibly important to continue that fight despite getting pushed back, despite not seeing immediate progress, because you are in a space that's opening that door and creating that wedge for the work to continue. So I would just say, don't stop, and build support systems around you that allow you to keep going.
And a final plug for different than Getting Real About Whiteness, but efforts of the DEI Collective are to align and unify inclusive practices, equity across nonprofits and public service sector in our community, recognizing that there's knowledge sharing there, and also like this community building thing's a thing. It's like a real thing. People need to have a group in which to learn and try things and explore. And so that's the project that we've done at small scale, and have had some great collaboration between TSS and City Kids and Grand Teton National Park. And we're looking at using that model to see how we can be more inclusive. I'm not sure if the person who asked the question was local, but for others out there, know that that's a place where we're excited to bring some connectivity.
Great. And there are a lot of local orgs all over the country who are working on similar things. Yeah, it's a great point. All of you are really great points. I hope that advice is useful. It can feel challenging for folks. I want to address a couple of questions that have come in because I feel like they're kind of cool and a little bit on the edge of spice that I like. So the first one is a very brief one. It's about the collective. If I'm part of an organization where this issue of social justice is directly part of our mission and wants to have the conversations in our community, do you offer help to facilitate the conversations? Short version of that is, it depends. Get in touch. We have a form on our website to get in touch with us if you're an organization or just an interest group or an individual. And we'd love to have conversations. We're not a consulting firm by any means. That's not what we do, but we are trying to make our community better. And this could be one way of doing that. And the other question, I'm actually gonna tweak this. You can probably see it on your screens here, but it's a question about race as a social construct. I think we mentioned that earlier, that race is a social construct. I wanted to talk about this briefly because this is part of, we just had in our last Getting Real About Whiteness session, a great conversation about the origin of race and the construction of race and how to have that conversation and how that applies to whiteness. So this person writes is, I worry the term is outdated and may feel dismissive to folks whose race is a valued or important part of their identity and lived experience. What are your thoughts? And so before you all speak, I will share briefly that when we talk about this in GRAW, we talk about it as a duality. There's a duality of race, that on one hand of things, race is very much artificial, it's constructed, it is biologically, culturally, ethnically insignificant. And those are just scientific truths and facts. And at the same time, we need to recognize, identify, believe in, and understand race, because race is important and it is real in that way. I wanted to throw that out there and see whether that sparks any thoughts from the panelists.
I'll try first. heavy on the try.
Give her a shot. Yeah.
And thank you for your compassion as I try to answer this. I believe that of race is a part of identities, and it's I believe that people should have and do have the sovereignty to be able to define what that race is and how it affects that identity. The oppression or privilege that is awarded because of race is the part to me that is constructed, and that's constructed based off of the structures and historical systems that have put in place hierarchical evaluation of how race fits in there, you know, better or worse. Yeah, so I hear the person who answered or asked the question in the race is very much a part of people. The effect that has is constructed by our society.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And it connects very deeply to one of I don't mean to keep plugging GRAW because I'm very proud of it, but also it's a good point of context that's one of the topics that we discuss is creating a positive white identity is often a part of one's identity development, even as a white person. Anyone else like to reflect on that question or Krista's response?
I think like what it calls to me is race versus ethnicity and in some bucket, but I think perhaps the most, and this is where you'll just see my operations brain coming out, because I'm like, what's the most useful right now? The most critical thing right now is the oppression of people based on our race constructs that I see, like that's like hypercritical. And so then I'm like, the construction of race and the knowledge of that and the interrogation of that is incredibly useful towards the ends of deconstructing it or working with what is real. And I can see how that could be at the expense of somebody feeling like they can own their identity and their fullness of what it means for them. So I see in this a lot of like both and yes, and I also see some habits of mind in myself about like either or, one or the other. And so what I tried to do in my answer is bring up what is the thing that's guiding my activity in this space, and it is to strive towards racial justice. And in that context, the construction of race and really deeply knowing that becomes very essential. So for me, it's like there's just a lot there. Whoever wrote that, let's chat.
Get in touch. I like the conversation. Colleen or Dan, anything to add?
Well, yeah, I puzzle over this myself because I can see that, we've had an evolution as a white race, and how you look at ethnicity within that is interesting also. And if you look at any history of indentured servitude in America, which ran parallel to the creation of slavery in America, they went on at the same time in parallel. One was white, one was African-based people of color that were brought here against their will. The indentured servants weren't necessarily brought here against their will. Some were, but not all. And so you have this class and this economic driver here. And over all these years, with all the changes we've had and the development of our economy, there seems to be, that we can see assimilation of these ethnic groups and even some of the lower economic groups into I guess what we would now look as a more unified white race. That didn't happen overnight. That's evolved over, a few centuries. And I think understanding, I find the race to be relevant to understanding the issue that we're trying to resolve here. Personally, I don't view it as antiquated. I view it almost as a bit of an evolution that we're still there. So I still find race to be a meaningful category, label or category.
I think we'd all agree that race is definitely something still very critical, and it's a complicated topic as well. Yeah. Any last thoughts, Colleen, before I move to a new question?
I think I've never seen my personal identity in opposition or in tension with social constructs. I think for me, it's a lot more fluid. And so for me personally, knowing that some of my identity has come out of this larger human social construction, it's not intention for me. And that's really just kind of where my head is at the moment.
Tension. We spend a lot of time thinking about tension and how it applies to these conversations, for sure. Getting back to the summit, hopefully everyone has had a wonderful time here. We're getting close to the end. The summit has these sort of values behind it, right? Equality, compassion, and courage. They're on the sign. They're on the label. Equality, compassion, and courage. I've heard a lot of compassion and courage from this group already, which is really, really wonderful to have experienced. And I'm curious to extend that. How does anti-racism work, especially as a white person engaged in anti-racism work? How does it connect to those values? How does it connect to equality, compassion, and courage? I'll give you a moment to think about that.
Well, I would ask the question, I would consider the question a little differently, and how does that translate into action of some kind? Because one of the things that I find troubling is we're engaging in a lot of useful and valuable conversation But at the end of the day, unless we do some things, that it does, it hasn't changed. It hasn't created change. And I would like to see us develop the capacity to be able to share ideas about things we could do more and more often. A friend of mine made a suggestion that's something he went and did, and he told me about it, and I was really impressed. I thought, God, that's a great idea. I wish I'd have thought of that. And he sought out a bank that is essentially a owned and operated Native American bank, and he placed a large certificate of deposit there, because most of their lending is to that community, which is underfunded and has difficulty getting capital to folks that want to develop develop businesses and things. And I thought, wow. And I think that there are race issues in addition to economic issues in lending in this country, despite legislation and programs that we've instituted over the years to sort of counteract that. Some have been more successful than others, but generally not that great. And I thought, God, that's really interesting. And so now I'm looking at that, thinking maybe I might be interested in doing something like that. And it's just when you can share ideas, you get more people thinking and sharing thoughts. And I guess at some point, I look for how all this conversation leads us to action.
I think action requires all of those things. Absolutely. Any reaction or other thoughts from other panelists?
Yeah, I think I'm interested in, maybe what stops folks before action. And, one of the earlier panels discussed fear and different categories of fear, and even broke them down. And the ones I thought were interesting and kind of related are fear of failure, fear of getting hurt, fear of the unknown, and fear of success. And I think that, fear of the unknown and fear of success here for white folks, that might be what's keeping our current reality in check. Because, racial justice does mean a radical shift for white folks in our understanding of the world and, structures in our communities and in our society, and also a world that doesn't put us to the center. And so that is a world that's unknown to many of us. And so there's a real fear there, I think. And working towards success could be a scary reality for some folks. I think about when, reactions to hearing defund the police, right? There's some initial reactions, maybe some initial panic to that. It proposes something new, something that is unknown to us at this time. It pushes our buttons to accept that our current police structure needs to change for others to feel safe in the country. And, if we allow that fear to dominate our reaction rather than to listen, that's something that's keeping us back from action.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Colleen, because that was also in the bank of potential things to explore. That conversation about fear and how it applies to this situation, and how I can imagine it might apply to, well, it certainly applies to some people who are watching, and maybe a lot of people who are watching. Krista, Jody, anything to add?
I think Colleen really spoke to a lot of what, as I'm looking at Sam's tile, I'm staring at courage. I feel like it's just courage. It's the practice of courage. And then I just put like the sprinkle of tenacity, right, to find the action, because we don't have enough pathways yet, or we're not connected to the pathways to understand what to do. We haven't allowed our brains to focus in a way that really pushes all of our skills and gifts towards solutions in this space. So I've been meditating on the courage and the thinking about how we can summon that up and sprinkle some resolve, because that makes me think about we for white people, the public the public reaction to George Floyd's death was a thing that happened this summer. For many, many other people, that was one of many other things that happened this summer. And there's a celebration of Black Lives Matter, and the more people being included in the social, the protests, right? But I think for us to even hang on to the idea that like we might be waning from George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, or that in fact we might feel like we've gotten somewhere because Kamala Harris is in office or going to be in office, or let's have some uncertainty there. That to me is a place where we need courage and resolve, and we need to get our heads out of the sand a little bit and wake up to like the real narrative that's happening here and our real moment in time. So that was different than equality, compassion, and courage. But there is something in there that's like a clear-eyed knowing and a refusal to look away and a refusal to disengage and just shrink back up into that white privilege that when I think about values and look at the tile, that's what's coming to the surface for me.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
In this conversation, what keeps coming for me is every time you speak, Dan, I hear so much vulnerability in your stories and in your voice. And what pulled in me is a comfort in my own vulnerability and a comfort in my own self-discovery. And it makes me think of, I guess I could tie it into compassion, but it makes me think of what that vulnerability and compassion could do for this community, small to large, and how it can reinstill civility as we navigate this. We're all at different stages and different levels of our understanding, of our acknowledgement, of our ability to act, and are in the process of acting. And if through leading with that compassion and seeing ourselves for where we are and who we are without judgment, and having that allow us to see others for who they are and where they are without judgment, I would like to believe that that brings out the best in everyone and begins to break down these barriers of defensiveness, whether that's a defensiveness of your own identity and reckoning with that element, seeing it for the first time, hearing things for the first time, being afraid, whether that's for your life or of the unknown. In all areas of the spectrum, I really believe that compassion can give us a beautiful place to start from.
Krista, that was super inspiring. Because you called out Dan, and I just want to call out, I've been really inspired by your courage in taking some of the hard questions first, and thanks for modeling direct gratitude in this space. I know we got a big audience that we can't see, but I just wanted to say that.
You're making me blush.
See, this is why I was excited to be with this group of people, because we can have those kind of conversations and we can say those kinds of things together. And I think this is one of the things that is born from stepping out and having the conversations. When we do that and we get practice with that, we get better at it and we can have these kinds of dialogues, which is terrific. Does anyone have any final thoughts on that before I bring us around into our sort of final question and topic? Okay. So before we get a chance for the remaining the white folks here in this space to talk more about ourselves and our perspectives, we want to take a moment to shout out some other people, other groups in the community, people who are mobilizing, amplifying, helping guide us into a more just future. This specific panel is focused on whiteness, and there's, as we explained before, there's a really specific reason why that's the case. But the issue, as we know, as we've been discussing and bouncing ideas this whole time about, we know that the issue is much bigger than that. So I'm going to be really bad at this because I always forget when someone's like, make sure that you talk about the important things. Two groups that I will call out directly are ALMA, the African American Latinx Multicultural Association, and Teton People of Color and Allies. There's so many people who've been doing this work way before us. Krista mentioned this before, for generations. It has been hundreds of years of effort. We are not the pinnacle of that by any means. We're just another partner. So shout out to all those people who are crushing it and doing really great stuff that we should be engaged with. Does anyone else in this space, before I ask the last question, want to shout anyone out? Anything else occur to you that you want to make sure is voiced?
The community mobilizers came to mind when you were speaking, as a group that's doing excellent work to build community, connect people to each other and resources.
Awesome. Wyoming also has a SURGE, Standing Up for Racial Justice group, although I am not particularly familiar with what they're up to. Okay, so
I would add this, that I was really interested. One of the things that's helped me a lot in the last couple of years was learning about mindfulness. And all of you have referred to that in some context. And I noticed that Sally in her presentation before ours also did. And I think that our ability to develop these kind of tools to help us to be able to better discuss and explore these really complicated and difficult issues is a really important step for all of us as individuals. Certainly it has been for me, and for the development of our community.
Thanks, Jan. All right,
can I make one little plug? As you said, Greg, there are groups out there doing really great work. There's also a lot of individuals who are leading the way in their own communities in their own ways, whether that's getting people of color outdoors and into the wilderness, to everything across the board. And I believe a really great way to begin getting educated, knowledgeable, and just even exposed to those people in that work is through social media. And you could find them all over Instagram. If you want some suggestions, I am happy to give you a handful of people that I follow who have really influenced my way of thinking and have opened so many doors for more resources of my own personal learning. So reach out and I'm happy to share those, but also just doing a really quick search on Instagram or Facebook can really introduce you to some great work out there.
Awesome, thank you.
Led by the people who are the people.
Yeah, Greg, and I know that we don't do panels much, but I would love to capture the, if you are out there, to all of the groups out there doing great work and trying to forward this work in whatever capacity, individuals, groups, etc., you should feel the beating heart of love, of sending you fortitude and energy and joy into the world.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, so our last question, and we designated an order of who's going to answer. So we'll start with Krista once again, and then Colleen, Dan, and Jody. And if we've got a couple of moments, I'm going to let Ijeoma Oluo be our last word of the day. So the final question: when you envision whiteness and leadership in the future, what are you optimistic about?
I should preface this that we got this question ahead of time, so I had some time to think about it. I am optimistic about the fact that these conversations are happening, that it's being exposed, that no longer is it this untalked about, touchy subject behind the curtain, that it's in our face. We're living it real time, and we're having to face it real time. We're having to find that courage to address it all. And to me, that's the first step towards making real meaningful change, is seeing the problem, looking it square in the eye, and beginning the process of eating the elephant, as Dan so poignantly said earlier.
Thank you, Krista. Colleen.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I think our current place in history has been built on the hope and the optimism of all of those who have come before us, and their vision for a more just and inclusive society. And so I think that that legacy continues to bring me optimism and hope, and also gratitude for the work that's already been done.
Wonderful. Thank you, Colleen. Dan?
I feel the global communication that's taking place, largely fostered by social media, gives me great optimism, because we can't remain isolated. At times, we've seen ourselves struggle mightily to try, even in some aspects today, and ultimately we can't succeed at that. And so I think that I'm optimistic that we will evolve, just as we have evolved for 400 years. This hasn't stopped, it's continued. We'd like to see it go faster, and certainly in some directions, but I'm really optimistic that we'll accelerate this, and in part because it has capacity to be a more global influence than just local, and we can't avoid that.
Great perspective. Jody?
Thanks. Let's see. When I feel what inspires me and makes me hopeful about whiteness and leadership in the future is really building community, is finding joy in this work, is what's happening right now on this screen. The fact that this is happening that's this dialogue with the 5 of us and however many people are watching. To me, that is that inspires in me measured hope, because I do believe that when we build our capacity and we can normalize these conversations and grow into them and live into them joyfully in community, that then we can become so much more precise with our intentions and so much more powerful and specific with our impacts. I know for me right now, I'm in a space of like, gotta do something. But as we build this collective knowledge and this collective, as we can have ways in which we can express our skills and gifts with the world in this space, all of a sudden we have all of these, in a bunch of years from now, my hope is that at this conference, everybody knows exactly what they're doing in this space. And that we can just build from here and just keep building the community outward. And again, I'll say it, I'm a believer in the joy factor. I believe this is hard work. I believe it's joyful work. And I think that's the way that we have the stamina to overcome some of the fear and the drudgery of just getting up and doing the stuff. That makes me hopeful. Community, people, you.
Thank you, Jody. I'll tell you, this conversation, you make me optimistic. This has been really wonderful. Huge gratitude to all of you, to the panelists today, Dan, Krista, Jody, Colleen. You've been really wonderful, much appreciated. Thanks to Sam and to Momentum and Anne-Marie on the back side, crushing it. Thanks to the audience for sticking it out through a really incredible program. And thanks to all the people who came before us, who've done so much work to get us to where we are. So I'd like to read a very brief passage from a book called So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijoma Oluo, so that she can have the last word. And I think this gets to something that we talked about in the last question here. Until we have dismantled the system of white supremacy and racial oppression, we will always need to talk about it. And I hope that you will use what you've read in this book, if you read the book, or in the conversation, to talk about it more successfully. And I hope that as you continue to have these conversations about race, you will see opportunities for action and use what you've learned from your conversations to make that action more effective at dismantling oppression. So take action. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Greg, Jody, Colleen, Krista, and Dan. It was really meaningful to have you here today. We so appreciate you sharing your insights and experience and wisdom, honestly, authentically, and frankly, vulnerably. It's really essential. We are grateful for this collaboration with the DEI Collective. And I also want to recognize Shelby Reed, Susan Scarlatta, Wendy Martinez, Fiola Zartbiel, and Jennifer Ford, who are also involved in helping us land at this really meaningful conversation. So thank you all.